Hey everyone, welcome back to Sociology Droids. We love diving deep into some of the most important texts in our field. And for today's deep dive, we've got a big one for her.
Definitely a classic.
It's Pierre Bourdieu's Masculine Domination. And this book, it's essential reading for any sociology grad student and really anyone grappling with, the complexities of power and gender.
Absolutely. And it's dense.
It is.
So we're going to break it down for you today, unpack some of the core arguments, and look at how Bourdieu builds his case.
Right. We'll get into the nitty-gritty, the examples he uses, and really try to make this, as accessible and engaging as possible.
Sounds good to me.
So where do we even begin with a book like this? There's so much to cover.
Well, I think a good place to start is with Bourdieu's idea of doxa. That's those unspoken beliefs that kind of shape our understanding of the world. Like we're all just playing a game and we rarely stop to question the rules.
Right. It's like it's all just common sense.
Yeah.
It just is what it is.
Yeah. Exactly. And Bourdieu uses this great example about Parisian traffic to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one.
So imagine thousands of cars navigating, those complex roundabouts like Place de la Bastille or Concorde.
Oh, yeah, a total nightmare. I'd get lost immediately.
Right, but it's remarkable how this intricate ballet of vehicles somehow works right. Each driver is kind of following these unspoken rules, and there's this order, this flow that's rarely disrupted, and you don't really see people rioting about the flow of traffic.
Okay, I'm with you there. But how does this connect to the idea of, masculine domination? It's a bit of a jump.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Bourdieu argues that masculine domination thrives as a form of doxa. It becomes so ingrained in society that it often feels natural, even inevitable. And he calls this symbolic violence.
Symbolic violence. Okay, that sounds kind of intense. Is it like mind control or something?
Not quite mind control, but it is about a subtle and often invisible form of power that shapes our bodies and minds without us even realizing it.
Okay, so give me an example of this, because I'm not quite wrapping my head around it.
Sure. Think of it like this. If someone's been told their whole life that they're, not good at math because they're a girl, they might be less likely to pursue it, right? Their options get limited, and those existing hierarchies get reinforced. That's symbolic violence at work.
Whoa. Okay, I see how that's way more insidious than just outright force. It's like it becomes embodied. It's not just beliefs, it's who we are physically, too.
Exactly. And Bourdieu uses the example of Kabyle society in Algeria, where he did a lot of his field work. He observed how specific practices like clothing posture, even the way people walk, are used to inscribe masculine and feminine principles onto bodies from a very young age.
And he talks about this specific ritual, right, called the separation in an air.
Yes.
It's like a coming-of-age ritual for boys, where they get their first haircut and are symbolically separated from the feminine sphere using fire and sharp objects. Talk about potent symbols.
Yeah, and these rituals aren't just symbolic. They actively shape individuals' understanding of themselves and their place in the social order. They're being molded to fit into those predetermined roles.
Makes you wonder, are there like modern-day equivalents to the separation in an air? What are the rituals and practices that continue to do this today? That's something to think about.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about language either.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, because language isn't neutral. It reflects and reinforces these power dynamics, too.
Exactly. Think about the gendered oppositions that are embedded in our language. Strong, weak, rational, emotional, active, passive. These aren't just words. They carry cultural baggage that reinforces the symbolic distinction between men and women.
And as Bourdieu points out, people internalize these categories.
They do.
It's like those women in the book who critique their bodies for being too big. They're aligning with these culturally imposed standards of beauty. They become complicit in their own subordination in a way.
Yeah, and he has a quote that really captures this. He says, the dominated apply categories constructed from the dominant point of view to themselves, leading to a form of self-depreciation. Pretty powerful stuff.
It really is. This is all pretty heavy stuff. Maybe we can take a break and come back to this a little later.
Actually, this is a good point to transition to a different example of symbolic violence. The male gaze.
Ah, yes. Bourdieu uses Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse to illustrate this right.
Yes, he analyzes the character of Mr. Ramsay, this seemingly intellectual man who's constantly trying to assert his dominance. But as Bourdieu points out, Mr. Ramsay's pronouncements reveal beneath their apparent gratuitousness the profound seriousness of the male game.
So even in intellectual circles, it's still all about this underlying power struggle. Like he's performing masculinity even when it's totally unnecessary.
And then you have Mrs. Ramsay, who sees right through her husband's attempts to assert his dominance, and her perspective embodies what Bourdieu calls a kind of reasoned, lucid awareness of the male world and its vanity.
It makes me wonder if these power dynamics are so deeply ingrained, even in seemingly progressive spaces. How can we ever hope to change them? Does Bourdieu offer any solutions?
Well, one thing he does is challenge the simplistic notion that individual men are to blame for gender inequality. He argues that it's institutions like the family, the church, the education system, the state, they all contribute to reproducing these power dynamics.
So it's not about blaming individuals, it's about recognizing the role of these larger social structures.
Exactly. He's pushing us to think beyond individual actions and examine the systems that perpetuate these inequalities, even unintentionally. And that leads us to his concept of the economy of symbolic goods, which we'll dive into after a quick break. So this economy of symbolic goods, it can be a little tricky to grasp at first.
Yeah, I was just thinking that
Yeah.
it sounds like we're talking about economics, but not in the traditional sense.
Right, it's not about money exactly. It's more about things like prestige, honor, social status. They become the currency in this symbolic economy.
Okay, so instead of dollars and cents, we're dealing with these more intangible markers of social standing.
Exactly. And the accumulation and exchange of this symbolic capital, as Bourdieu calls it, well, it often reinforces those existing social hierarchies, especially those related to gender.
Can you give us an example of how this plays out in real life? Like a specific situation where this symbolic economy is at work?
Marriage is a great example. Bourdieu argues that in many societies, marriage isn't simply a union of two individuals.
Right, it's more like a strategic alliance between families.
Exactly. They're considering factors like social status, reputation, even physical appearance. All these things become part of the equation, often unconsciously, of course.
So they're trying to protect their own symbolic capital and maybe even increase it through these unions.
Precisely. They're playing a kind of social chess, if you will, where marriage is a strategic move.
And this symbolic economy, it extends beyond just marriage, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about how families invest in their children's education, cultural experiences, social networks. It's all connected.
So these investments, they're not just about personal development, but about accumulating symbolic capital for their children, giving them an advantage in this game.
You got it. And this brings us back to the persistence of masculine domination. Even as societies change those deeply embedded structures and practices, they continue to reproduce inequality, often in very subtle ways.
But we have seen some progress, haven't we? I mean, women are in the workforce, they're in positions of power.
Yeah.
How does Bourdieu account for this?
He acknowledges that women's roles have evolved, but he emphasizes that those symbolic structures are incredibly resistant to change. They become embedded in our institutions, our language, even our bodies.
So even when things appear to be improving on the surface, those underlying power dynamics are still at play.
That's what Bourdieu is arguing. He says we need a symbolic revolution, but he's not naive about the challenges. It requires more than just changes in laws or policies.
It has to go deeper, right? It's about transforming perceptions, practices, the very way we see the world.
And this brings us to a crucial point. How does symbolic violence manifest in our everyday lives? Bourdieu observed this fascinating phenomenon in Kabyle society, which he called the logic of misrecognition.
The logic of misrecognition. Okay, that one sounds complicated. You're going to have to break that down for me.
Essentially, it's about how the dominated groups often internalize the dominant viewpoint. They come to see themselves through the lens of those in power, and it leads to this form of self-depreciation.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see what you mean. It reminds me of how women, even today, often use negative language to describe their bodies. Like they internalize the male gaze and this idea that they need to conform to certain beauty standards.
That's a perfect example. It's insidious. And as Bourdieu states, and I quote, symbolic violence is founded on a form of misrecognition. The dominated misrecognize the dominant order as legitimate, and in doing so, misrecognize themselves. A lot to unpack there.
It's like a vicious cycle, right? Symbolic violence leads to this misrecognition, which then just reinforces the power structures that created it in the first place.
Precisely. And Bourdieu doesn't let institutions off the hook either. He argues that even those claiming to promote equality can actually perpetuate these power dynamics without even meaning to.
I can see that. Think about how history is often taught from a male perspective. We're exposed to this dominant narrative, and it shapes how we understand the world. It's like, where are all the women?
That's a great point. And to quote Bourdieu again, the order of the world appears as self-evident because it is inscribed in a practical state in the bodies of individuals who through their actions continually produce and reproduce it.
So even when we think we're being progressive, we could be unknowingly perpetuating these systems. That's kind of a depressing thought.
It can be. But remember, as Bourdieu says, recognizing the problem is the first step. And one of the most powerful ways these systems maintain themselves is through controlling and regulating women's bodies.
It's interesting you say that because even in modern society, there's this constant policing, scrutiny, objectification of women's bodies. How does Bourdieu explain that?
He argues that symbolic violence operates directly on our bodies. It's not just about beliefs and perceptions, it shapes our physical experiences and how we move through the world.
I can relate to that. It's like that feeling of being self-conscious in public,
Yeah.
always aware of how you're being perceived, especially as a woman.
Exactly. And Bourdieu observes that women's bodies are often subject to stricter social control than men's. There are these expectations around modesty, femininity, sexual availability, all these things that limit women's freedom.
It's like we're still stuck in this world where women are defined by their bodies while men are defined by their achievements.
And this, as Bourdieu argues, is a key aspect of how masculine domination persists. It limits women's options, reinforces traditional gender roles, and ultimately perpetuates that inequality.
This all raises the question of how we can challenge these deeply ingrained structures. Where do we even begin to dismantle something so pervasive?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we need to explore further. But before we get into specific strategies for resistance, I think it's crucial to understand how Bourdieu sees these power dynamics playing out in language.
Yeah, we touched on this earlier, but I'd love to dive deeper into that because it's like language isn't just a tool for communication. It's a weapon that can be used to reinforce those power structures.
That's a powerful way to put it. And Bourdieu analyzes this brilliantly. He points to the ways in which language often reflects and perpetuates gender stereotypes, embedding them in our everyday conversations.
It's like when we use phrases like throw like a girl or man up. Those seemingly harmless expressions actually reinforce the idea that certain behaviors are inherently masculine or feminine.
Exactly. And Bourdieu argues that those gendered oppositions, strong, weak, rational, emotional, active, passive, they're not just descriptive. They carry these implicit judgments and valuations shaping our understanding of what it means to be masculine or feminine.
So language itself becomes a tool for inscribing these gendered categories onto our bodies and minds, influencing how we perceive ourselves and others.
He even says, and I'm quoting here, the structure of the masculine order is discernible even in the anatomical lexicon, which through euphemisms and dysphemisms betrays the male point of view on female genitals. That's pretty striking.
Wow. Yeah, that really highlights how deep those biases run, even in the way we talk about our own bodies.
And this linguistic domination can be incredibly insidious. Bourdieu observes that the dominated apply categories constructed from the dominant point of view to themselves, leading to a form of self-depreciation.
So it's like internalizing the language of oppression, turning it against ourselves.
Yeah,
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, but with words instead of blades.
that's a great analogy. And this linguistic violence is a key aspect of how masculine domination is maintained. It shapes our thoughts, our perceptions, ultimately our actions.
It can all feel very disempowering. If language is so powerful and these structures are so deeply embedded, how can we even hope to challenge them? It's a bit overwhelming.
It can feel that way. But Bourdieu argues that recognizing the problem is the first step towards challenging it. And to fully understand his approach to resistance, we need to delve into another key concept: collective action.
Yeah, that's something I can get behind. I've always been a big believer in the power of people coming together to create change.
And Bourdieu shares that belief. He argues that individual acts of defiance, while important, are often not enough to dismantle those entrenched systems of power.
It's like trying to move a mountain by yourself. It takes a collective effort to make a real impact.
Exactly. And Bourdieu highlights the crucial role of collective movements in challenging symbolic violence and promoting social change.
He's talking about movements like the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, those movements that challenge the status quo and demand justice and equality, right?
Precisely. Those movements, as Bourdieu observes, have played a pivotal role in raising awareness, challenging dominant ideologies, and creating new spaces for resistance and solidarity. They're essential.
It's like this collective awakening where people start to see the world differently and realize they're not alone in their struggles.
And this collective awareness is essential for dismantling symbolic violence. To quote Bourdieu again, the dominated must break the relationship of magical belief which binds them to the dominant, and they can do this only by discovering their own strength, a strength based on collective mobilization.
So it's not just about individual enlightenment, but collective empowerment, finding that strength in numbers and using it to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And Bourdieu highlights the importance of collective organization, mobilization, and strategic action in dismantling symbolic violence.
So it's not enough to just be aware of the problem. We need to work together to create concrete solutions and demand change.
Now you're getting it. And this brings us to another crucial element of Bourdieu's analysis, the role of culture in perpetuating symbolic violence.
Okay, we've talked about institutions and language, but I can definitely see how culture plays a big part in shaping our perceptions and reinforcing gender stereotypes.
It's everywhere. Think about how women are often portrayed in movies and TV shows, for example. They're often damsels in distress or objects of male desire, and these representations reinforce those harmful stereotypes and contribute to the normalization of masculine domination.
It's true. We need to be more critical of the media we consume and recognize those subtle messages.
Absolutely. And Bourdieu argues that we need to be critical consumers of culture, recognizing those subtle ways in which it can perpetuate symbolic violence. But it's not about censorship.
Right. It's about awareness and understanding the messages being sent and how they might be reinforcing harmful power dynamics.
Exactly. And we also need to create alternative forms of cultural expression, those that challenge dominant narratives and promote more equitable representations.
So we need to rewrite the script, so to speak, and create new stories that celebrate diversity and challenge the status quo.
Yes. And this cultural shift is a crucial aspect of dismantling symbolic violence. Bourdieu says, and I quote, "The dominated must fight on two fronts. They must attack the material and symbolic instruments of domination and construct a counterculture capable of undermining the principles on which the domination is based. It's a two-front war."
So dismantle the old and build something new in its place. It's about challenging the dominant culture while simultaneously creating this culture of resistance and liberation.
Exactly. And this cultural transformation is essential for achieving lasting social change. It's about shifting the very foundations of how we understand gender and power.
This is all incredibly insightful, but I have to admit it can feel a bit overwhelming. It's like we're up against these massive invisible forces that shape so much of our lives.
I understand that feeling. But remember, as Bourdieu argues, understanding these mechanisms of power is the first step. And he reminds us that resistance is possible even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
So what are some concrete ways we can resist? How do we put these ideas into action and actually make a difference?
That's a question we're going to explore further. And to fully grasp Bourdieu's approach to resistance, we need to delve into another one of his key concepts: his analysis of how symbolic violence operates through history.
Now that's interesting to me. I've always been fascinated by how history is often used to justify and perpetuate those existing power structures.
Bourdieu breaks this down brilliantly. He argues that symbolic violence isn't just a modern thing. It's been a feature of human societies for a long time, deeply embedded in our historical narratives and cultural traditions.
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors.
Yeah.
Right. The dominant group gets to shape the narrative, and that narrative often reinforces their power and legitimacy.
Exactly. And Bourdieu challenges us to look at those historical narratives with a critical eye to uncover those hidden stories of women and other marginalized groups. History is not a neutral record of the past. It can be a tool for legitimizing symbolic violence.
So it's not just about adding a few more women to the history books. It's about challenging the very foundations of how history is written and taught. A complete reframing.
He says, and I quote, "The most successful ideological effects are those which have no need for words and ask no more than complicitous silence." It's about uncovering those silences.
So it's not just about adding a few more women to the history books. It's about challenging the very foundations of how history is written and taught.
Exactly. And this historical awareness, as Bourdieu argues, is essential for understanding how symbolic violence persists across generations. He says, the past weighs on the present even when it is not consciously remembered.
It's like those ghosts of the past are still shaping our perceptions and behaviors, even if we don't realize it.
And Bourdieu challenges us to confront those ghosts, unpack their baggage, and create new historical narratives that challenge dominant ideologies and promote justice and equality.
It's a lot to take in, I have to say. It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, and each layer reveals more complexity and more challenges.
It's true. But as Bourdieu argues, understanding these mechanisms of power is the first step towards challenging them. And to fully grasp how symbolic violence operates, we need to delve into another key concept: the male gaze.
Oh yes, the male gaze. We talked about this a little bit before, but I'm ready to dive deeper into it now, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with images constantly.
It's more relevant than ever. And Bourdieu's analysis of the male gaze is still incredibly relevant today. He argues that it's this pervasive force that shapes women's experiences and self-perceptions, often leading to self-objectification and a feeling of being constantly evaluated and judged based on appearance.
That feeling of being watched, being reduced to your body, being seen as an object rather than a subject, I know that feeling.
Exactly. And Bourdieu argues that the male gaze isn't just about individual men looking at women, it's structural. It's embedded in our culture and institutions.
I mean, it's everywhere you look, right? In advertising, movies, TV shows, music videos, even in the way we talk about women's bodies.
Precisely. And as Bourdieu observes, it operates by objectifying women, reducing them to their physical appearance and sexual desirability.
It's like women are constantly being told that their worth is tied to their looks.
And this objectification is a key aspect of how symbolic violence operates. He says the male gaze implies a relationship of power in which the man is the subject and the woman is the object.
So it's not just about looking, it's about power and control. The male gaze reinforces that idea that men are the subjects, the agents, the ones in control, while women are the objects, the passive recipients of male attention and judgment.
Exactly. And this power dynamic is deeply embedded in our cultural norms and practices.
Think about how often women are told to smile more, dress more attractively, be more pleasing to the male eye. It's like we're expected to perform for the benefit of men.
And this performance can be very insidious. It can lead to self-objectification, where women internalize the male gaze and start to see themselves through that lens.
It's like we become our own worst critics, constantly scrutinizing our bodies and striving to conform to these impossible beauty standards. It's exhausting.
It is. And this self-objectification can have a profound impact on women's lives. It can limit their choices, erode their self-esteem, contribute to those feelings of shame and inadequacy.
This all feels very disempowering. If the male gaze is so pervasive and so ingrained in our culture, how can we ever hope to challenge it? Is there even a way?
It's a tough question. But Bourdieu argues that challenging the male gaze requires a multi-pronged approach. It involves raising awareness, promoting alternative representations, and ultimately shifting those power dynamics that underpin it.
So it's about changing individual perceptions and societal structures simultaneously. A two-pronged attack.
Precisely. We have to recognize that the male gaze is not just this harmless quirk of human nature. It's a form of symbolic violence that can have real and lasting consequences for women.
This has been a very eye-opening conversation, to say the least.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, it's a bit disheartening to think about how widespread these power dynamics truly are. It's like we're up against these massive, invisible forces that shape our lives in so many ways.
It can feel that way. But Bourdieu reminds us that recognizing the problem is the first step towards challenging it. And he does offer some valuable insights into potential strategies for resistance, which we'll delve into after a quick break. Welcome back to Sociology Droids. We were just discussing the male gaze and how it perpetuates symbolic violence.
Yeah, and it's left me feeling a bit overwhelmed, honestly. I mean, if these power dynamics are so deeply entrenched in us, even unconsciously, is real change even possible? Like, where do we even begin to tackle something this big?
That's the question, isn't it? And Bourdieu grapples with this throughout his work. He sees the challenges, but he also points to some ways we can resist these forces.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk solutions. What does Bourdieu suggest?
Well, he emphasizes education, but not in the way we typically think about it. He's talking about a radical transformation of the entire education system, something that challenges those underlying assumptions and power dynamics that lead to inequality.
So it's not just about adding a few more women to the history books or offering a gender studies course here and there.
It goes much deeper than that. It's about questioning the very structures that perpetuate these power dynamics, examining how knowledge is produced, validated, transmitted, who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, whose voices are heard, whose perspectives are valued.
It sounds like a monumental task. Like we need a complete system overhaul.
It's a huge undertaking, no doubt. But as Bourdieu argues, it's necessary if we want to dismantle those deeply embedded structures that allow symbolic violence to thrive.
This makes me think about Bourdieu's concept of habitus. You know how he says that our dispositions and practices are shaped by our social experiences, especially early on. If those experiences are rooted in inequality, how could we ever break free from those ingrained patterns? It's like we're fighting against our own programming.
That's a great point. And that's where Bourdieu's idea of symbolic revolution comes into play. He argues that real change requires more than just surface-level adjustments to laws or policies. It demands a transformation of our deepest dispositions, a reprogramming of our habitus.
So we're talking about a personal and collective metamorphosis.
In a way, yes. It's a profound shift in consciousness, both individually and collectively. It requires us to take a long, hard look at the beliefs and behaviors we've inherited, to question those taken for granted assumptions that shape our
And
lives.
so it's about recognizing those invisible strings that control us and then making the conscious choice to cut them.
That's a great way to put it. And Bourdieu argues that this process of waking up, of challenging the dominant order, is essential for achieving lasting social change. He says, and I'm quoting here, "The dominated must break the relationship of magical belief, which binds them to the dominant, and they can do this only by discovering their own strength, a strength based on collective mobilization."
It's about realizing that we have the power to challenge and change these systems that oppress us, not as individuals, but as a collective force.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of Bourdieu's analysis, the role of collective action in challenging symbolic violence.
We've talked about the power of movements like the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ plus rights movement, all those movements that are demanding justice and equality.
And Bourdieu argues that these movements are absolutely essential for dismantling symbolic violence. They raise awareness to challenge those dominant ideologies, create those spaces for resistance and solidarity, and ultimately push for structural change. They're the engine of progress.
He uses the feminist movement as a key example, right?
He does. He sees it as a prime example of a collective struggle against symbolic violence, a movement that has fundamentally challenged those deeply ingrained assumptions about gender and power.
And it's not just about women's rights. It's about applying these insights to all forms of oppression and inequality across the board.
Absolutely. Bourdieu's work gives us this framework for understanding how power operates in all its forms, whether it's based on gender, race, class, sexual orientation, anything. And he emphasizes that the struggle for liberation is ongoing. It requires constant vigilance and collective action. We can't let up.
It's a reminder that the work is never done, that we have to keep pushing, keep challenging, keep fighting for a more just and equitable world. So I guess that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Pierre Bourdieu's masculine domination.
We've covered a lot of ground today, explored his key concepts, his analysis of symbolic violence, and his ideas about resistance and change.
It's been intense, but incredibly insightful. Bourdieu's work gives us a powerful lens for understanding how gender and power operate, and it challenges us to be more critical in our thinking and more active in our pursuit of change.
And for all you sociology droids out there, remember, this is just the beginning. Bourdieu's work is a starting point for further exploration and analysis. Its relevance only continues to grow as we grapple with these issues in the 21st century. Thanks for joining us.
And keep those sociological minds engaged.